When Charizard EX first came out, everyone knew it was going to be strong. 330 HP, an ability that accelerated energy to itself and other Pokemon in play, and a great attack that scaled with damage for every prize card your opponent had taken, so you could punish your opponents for playing more aggressively. And on top of that, it was a Dark type, and the Dark type was a great type at the time because you would hit Mew VMAX for weakness, which was a Psychic type. However, in the beginning, Charizard EX struggled to find an identity. Many people were experimenting with many different types of the deck. The first one that emerged was Charizard Gallade, and then there was Charizard Lost Box, Charizard Arceus, and now the most common and most well-known, Charizard Pidgeot, and this is kind of the identity that the deck ended up taking. At its second ever regional, it won first place, and this is where the infamous Charizard Pidgeot began. This over here was the first ever successful iteration of Charizard Pidgeot. Obviously, it's very different as to what it looks like today, because it's gone through multiple rotations. Originally, we had a very thick 4-1-3 Charizard line. Remember, back in the day, item lock was not something you'd have to worry about. Nowadays, we have something called Badoo, and when you use Badoo, it means your opponent can't use item cards, and item cards are obviously very, very strong, and the lifeblood for most decks, such as Charizard in this instance. We played a very heavy line of items to help set up the Charizards, and on top of that, it was an Arven-based build. Arven-based builds usually rely on items to set up their board state. Arven lets you search for a tool card and an item card, and yeah, usually you would be able to set up your Pidgeot around turn 2, and then from there you'd be able to get your Charizard EX and just start swinging. It was a great beat stick deck with a lot of options. The nice thing about the deck was, since it played Pidgeot EX as its engine, you were able to search your deck for whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted. For example, if you needed a Choice Belt to deal a little bit more damage, you could get that straight away. If you needed a Boss's Orders to target something on the bench, you could get that right away as well. And this is what Charizard ended up becoming, a beatstick deck with great potential to combo cards whenever it really needed it. And because Charizard is a lot of people's favorite Pokemon, this deck ended up becoming very, very popular. As we can see, moving forward, there was a lot of Charizard EX decks. The deck was really good, and also fairly simple to play, with a really high skill cap. So if you were a beginner at the game, well, you could probably pick up Charizard and do fine. And if you're really good at the game, you could pick up Charizard and win consistently. And from November 2023, we saw Charizard really pick up. A first place over in the Philippines Regional League, and then consecutive second places at regionals, and a flurry of other placements. Its first major break came over in 2024 EUIC, where none other than Tordireklev was able to get first place with his Charizard EX Pidgeot deck. This deck ended up becoming the identity for Charizard Pidgeot moving forward, as you still had your Pidgeot, you also now had a 1-1 Bidoof and Barrel line. The 1-1 Bidoof and Barrel were really strong, as this deck didn't really have much draw power. Sure, you'd be able to search out for whatever you wanted with Pidgeot and Arven, but you never really had that many cards that could just consistently draw you cards. For example, you did play 3 Iono, but if you wanted to play something like a Professor's Tauros that turn, you wouldn't be able to use an Iono to draw cards. So Bibarel came in really handy, as its ability Industrial Incisors let you draw up until you had 5 cards in your hand every single turn, and that was the boost in consistency that this deck needed. And as you can see, a lot of the cards that we saw in that original Charizard EX Pidgeot list are no longer included. Back then you had Battle VIP Pass, however, when rotation hit, that was replaced with a much better card, Buddy Buddy Poffin. Although you might say it's not as good of a card, because Buddy Buddy Poffin can only get you Pokemon with 70 HP or less, whereas Battle VIP Pass could get you any basic Pokemon on your first turn. The problem was, it was only on your first turn, so if you weren't able to find your Battle VIP Pass in your first turn, you would be punished and probably have a slower game, and the game ended up becoming this really stale format where whoever started with more Battle VIP Passes in their hand usually ended up winning. So Buddy Buddy Poffin ended up pairing really well with Charizard, as even on your second or third turn, you could still use an Arven to search out for your Buddy Buddy Poffin and search your deck for basic Pokemon such as Charmander, Pidgey, and your Bidoof. This helped consistency a lot, and also you can see there's a lot more consistency cards, such as the Rotom V, Luminion is still in the deck, and also a Cleffa letting you draw up until you had 7 cards in your hand for 0 energy. And as time went on, Charizard kept winning. This wasn't a surprise, as the deck ended up becoming so powerful, being able to utilize so many cards in the format. And at the end of 2024, we saw Charizard have arguably the best form in its life, a first and second place over in the regional at Stuttgart, and it just kept winning. However, that's not to say the deck never had its struggles, and in the earlier stages of 2025, Charizard hit its low point, and this is because of a few reasons, one of them being Badoo. This 30 HP little Pokemon had an attack called Itchy Pollen. For no energy cost, it did 10 damage, and said your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during the next turn. and as we've mentioned, Charizard really relied on item cards. However, Budew wasn't the only problem. It was also the deck that used Budew, Dragapult. Dragapult was just a very strong deck at the time, and also arguably the better user of the Dusk Noir card, a card that Charizard built its identity upon. Another thing that Charizard only did a lot of damage once your opponent had taken a lot of prize cards, and Dragapult was really good at playing around that. Dragapult was a deck that would be able to play from behind very often and set up the board state in a way that they could take all of their prizes in the same turn. It was a really difficult matchup for Charizard EX. However, as time moved on, we saw a deck that Dragapult struggled with emerge, and that deck was Gardevoir EX. And Gardevoir EX, a psychic type that Dragapult really struggled to deal with, because Dragapult now had to deal with Clefairy, and Clefairy stated that all Dragon-type Pokemon in play are now weak to Psychic. It had a really tough time getting through Gardevoir EX, and Gardevoir EX ended up having the most dominant run that I think any deck has ever had in the Pokemon trading card game, winning event after event. And Charizard, well, it was nowhere to be seen. That was until Milwaukee Regionals. At this regional, a lot of people thought Gardevoir was going to win again, and the thing is, Gardevoir kinda struggled at this event. You see, a new deck had emerged. It was the Absol box built by Tord Reklev, and that deck had a really good time into the meta. However, what wasn't in the meta? Charizard. So a few things went right at this tournament for Charizard. One, there wasn't a lot of Dragapult. Due to the fact that there was so many Gardevoir EX running about, Dragapult was just not a safe pick. And Absol Box was also being played by a lot of the top players, so there was a lot of them at the top tables. And that deck never really prepared for Charizard EX. On top of that, there was still a lot of Goldengo, and Charizard EX has a great time into Goldengo. So what happens when you put Charizard EX at the top tables? Against decks that you can take 3 prize cards against Gardevoir EX that already isn't a bad matchup, and against decks like Goldengo that, just as Gardevoir, isn't a bad matchup. Well, you'd put your money on Charizard to win, and that's exactly what happened. Jackson Ford ended up winning with Charizard EX, and this was Charizard's first win in a while. It hadn't tasted gold in recent times, so it was great to see Charizard finally win again. However, what would happen in the next regional would kind of suck for all the Charizard enjoyers, as Dragapult came out in full force, and when Dragapult is out and about, Charizard doesn't have a great time. Not only that, the Absol box wasn't nearly as much of a surprise as it was last time, and Gardevoir kind of faltered, so Dragapult came out on top, not only winning the tournament, but having a mirror match in the finals. And moving forward, this doesn't look great for Charizard. Obviously, Charizard struggles against Dragapult, and if Dragapult is the most played deck again, well, Charizard might just have to bow out once again. However, that is not the end of the story for Charizard. You see, moving forward, we have Phantasmal Flames, and that brings us Mega Charizard EX. We have seen Mega Charizard EX have some good success over in Japan, but will that translate into success in the Western format? Well, only time will tell. Will Charizard EX find a foothold in the meta yet again, or has its final chapter finally been written?